Okay, so the brown algae, so they have chloroplasts, they are able to do photosynthesis, but they also have brown pigments that make them actually look brown. So they have chlorophylls, they also have fucoxanthin, which is the brown pigment. They're temperate, meaning they don't live in really warm waters or really cold waters, but kind of in between temperatures, and they're marine, so you only find them in salt water in the ocean. They're free floating, so many of these are what you would call seaweed. A few of them have kind of an anchor that will attach them to the bottom of the ocean, but many of them just float. And like I said, this is sometimes what we call seaweed. So in terms of why these might be important, they are a source of algin. So if you squish these multicellular algae, a very gelatinous material comes out. This is what algin is, and it's used in ice creams and salad dressings and cosmetics. It's basically something that holds all of the chemicals together. So it can be used in cosmetics as well as in food products, and you will probably see it as algin or alginate if you look on the label of maybe your cosmetics or some of your food products. Fucus, and you don't have to memorize this name, but just so you can see a little bit different looking, you can see that it's not really green, it's more brown, and this one can be attached to the bottom of the ocean. Sargassum, again, you don't have to know the name, but this is the one that's found in the Gulf of Mexico. This is the seaweed that usually washes up. You can see, let me get a different color here so you'll be able to see it. You can see these little balls right here. Those are floats. They're full of air, and that helps to hold the seaweed up near the surface of the water so that it'll float. It'll be able to be exposed to sunlight and do photosynthesis. And I don't know if you can see in this picture here, but there's a sargassum fish in there that is colored just like the seaweed, so it makes a very good camouflage for that fish. And then macrocystis, again, you don't have to know the scientific name. I would like you to know it at least as kelp. But these are quite large brown algae. A lot of times you find them on the Pacific side. They grow underwater, and they're considered to grow in forests because they get pretty tall and they grow pretty fast. So they have these little air bladders too that help to hold them up so that they're exposed to sunlight. They have a lot of iodine in them, which makes them something that people might consume. And they're also sometimes used as fertilizers. So I'm going to not show this video right now, this kelp farming video, but when you pull up the PowerPoint, I want you to click on that video. And basically it shows how some of the fishermen who are not able to make a living fishing anymore have actually started to grow kelp as a product that they can sell and use in restaurants and so forth. So it's people are kind of pivoting from one farming product to another depending on what's happening in their environment. So I like this picture just because it's a little bit easy to see. It doesn't have roots, but it has something that helps it attach to the bottom of the ocean. And then it has these long, they're not stems, there's no vascular tissue within them, but it's a much larger type of algae. Okay, so we've talked about green and why it's important, green algae. We've talked about the brown algae and some of the uses for brown algae and how we would classify it. The golden algae are yellowish in color. The common name for these guys is the diatoms. You can find them both in freshwater and marine water, so they're pretty ubiquitous. And these are the big producers of oxygen of all of the algae. These are the big producers, okay? When you look at their cells, they're symmetrical. They have a top half and a bottom half that kind of fit together like a little pillbox. And their cell walls do not have cellulose. They have silica in their cell walls, okay? And it's glass-like. And so When the organism dies, these glass-like cell walls fall to the bottom of the ocean, and this is what we call diatomaceous earth, and it's somewhat abrasive. It's used in toothpastes, it's used in pool filters. Some people use it as an organic pesticide for ants in their backyard. So there are some uses. You can go and buy a bucket of diatomaceous earth at Home Depot or Lowe's or whatever. Okay, so these pictures help illustrate the symmetrical characteristic. You can see when they're alive, they've got this kind of golden color to them. So they've got the golden color pigments. These pictures on the left-hand side here are electron micrographs, and so much higher resolution, but you can see that the silica wall has lots of holes in it, and so that helps water come in and out of the cell, and nutrients come in and out of the cell, and so forth. You can see it in some of these pictures here, but it's a lot easier to see that on an electron micrograph. And then this one is a compound micrograph, like from a light microscope that we might use in one of our labs, and you can kind of see those little holes in the glass. This is a nice picture to illustrate the pillbox idea, that there's a top and a bottom that fit together. Okay, so the dinoflagellates. Dino refers to two, and flagellate refers to the fact that they have flagella, long tail-like appendages. Okay, so sometimes they're called fire algae because they are the ones that can lead to the red tides. And sometimes they're called whirling cells because they have the two flagella, and when they're both going, the cells kind of whirl around. So these are only found in the ocean, in salt water. They, like I said, most of them have two flagella. This is where red tides come from. In terms of their importance in the ecosystem, many small animals in the ocean eat the dinoflagellates, so they're part of an important food chain in the ocean. Okay, so these are electron micrographs. It kind of helps you see that they have two flagella, and when they're not moving, they just kind of wrap that flagella around the middle part of the cell. So I tried to find a couple of pictures of red tide. The reason it's called red tide is that they do have some red pigments that, if they're overproducing, which would be considered a bloom, overgrowth of the dinoflagellates, the water actually looks red. And a lot of them produce these neurotoxins, which will kill any of the organisms living in the water that might be eating them. Okay, so in this picture you can kind of see, and this is in the Gulf of Mexico, that there's a huge bloom of these red algae, or I'm sorry, these dinoflagellates that makes the red tide. And then when this happens, you see at that time a lot of those organisms, the fish and the shrimp and the crabs, washing up dead on the beaches because of the neurotoxins that are produced. So I guess it's been about 2 years ago now, they had a pretty big red tide in Florida, and two of my kids actually happened to be in Florida that summer, and the amount of chemical that was produced by these organisms was actually getting into the air, where they had to wear masks on the beach because the respiratory system was being affected by the chemicals that were being produced by these organisms that caused the red tide. So you can see it started sometime in July of that year, but went all the way through November. And I didn't bring a map or put a map on the other side, but it did end up over here on the Atlantic side too. So it was a pretty big red tide that caused some major fish kills. Okay, so dinoflagellates cause red tides, and they do have some red pigments, but we have another group of algae that we call the red algae, and they have a lot of red pigments, so they actually look red or pink. These are marine, they live in the ocean, tropical waters, so they have these red pigments called phycobilins. Because of the red pigments, they're able to live a little bit deeper in the water and still absorb sunlight. And they also are an important source for things that humans use. So they're a source of agar, which is what we use to make our Petri plates. So it's kind of jelly-like. And they also produce carrageenan, which is similar to algin in the brown algae that you'll find as a thickener sometimes in ice creams and whipped cream, and even sometimes in some of your salad dressings. Okay. The red algae, porphyra, is the scientific name. You don't have to know that, but the red algae are actually used to make the sushi wrappers called nori, and that's what you would wrap your rice and whatever else you put into your sushi. So it's dried, the red pigments break down, and then the nori looks kind of green because you still see some of the green pigments. Okay, now I believe this is the last one in the group of algae, and these are called the euglenoids, and we put them last here because they have a couple of characteristics that make them a little bit more animal-like. So we did show a few organisms of algae that had a flagella that then make them be able to move, but these also have an eye spot. Okay, so you can see the eye spot down here. The eye spot is not used to see, but it's used to orient them towards the light so that they can do photosynthesis. Okay, so most animal-like because they can move and they have an eye spot, but because they're green, we put them in the algae category. They don't have a thick cell wall like the other algae. It's a little bit more flexible, and they have chlorophyll, which will make them green. Okay, so I've loaded a couple of videos for you to watch when you bring up your PowerPoint, just to give you a little idea of what these organisms look like and how they move. Okay, so here's on the left a micrograph, and on the right a figure. You're not going to have to be able to label all the parts.